Chapter 5. Waiting for the Crown. For the first time in many years, Eleanor was happy. She had cast aside a dull king for a bold young knight, with whom life promised to be anything but boring. In the autumn following their marriage, Eleanor and Henry took a honeymoon in Aquitaine. Henry could not help but be pleased with what he saw. The lush vineyards, olive orchards, plump grazing sheep, sleek horses, well-stocked hunting grounds, and the best-trained falcons in all Europe. In Bordeaux, he cast his practical eye on the merchant ships being loaded with barrels of red wine. He had done well to marry Eleanor. The Aquitanians were happy to have their duchess home again, but they did not feel so kindly toward her husband, a foreigner to them. They mistrusted his authoritarian manner. Henry sensed this hostility and had a hard time keeping his temper. Once he didn't. When some of Eleanor's vassals failed to show him proper respect as their new duke, he flew into one of his famous black rages, screaming and cursing, kicking and smashing furniture, his eyes red with uncontrollable anger. When his tantrums subsided, he was still resentful and meted out unnecessarily harsh punishments. If Eleanor was shocked at his behavior, she did not show it or let it mar their happiness. But if she had any secret thoughts of managing this young husband as she had Louis, she soon realized that he was no more to be managed than she was. After this trip, Henry felt the time had come to go to England to press his claim to the English throne. In case there was opposition, he took 146 knights and hundreds of archers. He left Eleanor in charge of their combined lands. So many lands and titles. They were now Duke and Duchess of Normandy, Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine, Count and Countess of Anjou, Count and Countess of Poitiers. It would have seemed enough to most people, but Henry's ambitions were boundless, and so were Eleanor's. During Henry's absence, Eleanor sometimes stayed in his castle in Anjou, sometimes in her own in Poitiers, both more pleasing to her than the cold, bleak castle in Paris. Eleanor was pregnant, but busier than ever, governing in Henry's place, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, as though to prove her new happiness. She generously granted charters, giving privileges to towns and churches, the use of forests for firewood, ponds for fishing. She gave freely of her own wealth for building projects. Attached to one gift, she wrote, "With a glad heart, now that I am joined in wedlock to Henry, Duke of Normandy." Eleanor found time to pursue her own interests, too. Free from the restraints of Louis's puritanical court, she set about creating a court to her own taste. No one was better equipped than the well-traveled Eleanor to be the center of a refined and cultivated court. She had not forgotten the elegance and luxury, the courtesy and ceremony in the courts of Constantinople and Antioch. Eleanor wanted a court where music, poetry, and literature could flourish, where good manners and respect for ladies would be observed. She welcomed young knights and the footloose troubadours who had been dismissed from Paris after her divorce. She became a magnet for wandering minstrels and poets who flocked to her court to sing her praises and to take advantage of her generosity. Among those vying to please the Duchess was a young troubadour, Bernard de Ventadour, whose romantic love songs in the provincial dialect of the day expressed the ideals of chivalry Eleanor was so eager to spread. Doma per vostre amor, Juan las mas edor, Jean cour ab fresca color, grand mal mi faies traer. Sweet lady, for your love, with clasped hands I bless your radiance, high above my deep unhappiness. In verse after verse, Bernard poured out wildly romantic longings for his beautiful, gracious lady, who he knew was far beyond his reach. Whether or not Bernard was really in love with Eleanor, she was his inspiration and patroness, as she was for many other poets and writers. A whole new lifestyle and a new romantic literature were beginning at Eleanor's court. Tales of the great hero Charlemagne, which praised only warriors' courage in battle, were giving way to tales of adventure in which women were important. The joy of love was added to the joy of battle. Ancient Celtic stories of King Arthur, his knights, and his Queen Guinevere, sung by bards and handed down from generation to generation, traveled along the pilgrim highways to inns and castles. At Eleanor's court they fired the imaginations of poets, who put them into written verse for the first time, often at Eleanor's request. In these retold Celtic tales, the knights no longer battled just for their king, but for a lady. They went on long, perilous adventures to prove their valor, loyalty, and love for some beautiful woman. The heroes and heroines of these stories behaved and expressed more like the knights and ladies at Eleanor's court than like their original Celtic counterparts. They expressed Eleanor's ideals of chivalry and longing for romance. As Eleanor was striving to elevate the position of women, the worship of the Virgin Mary was also spreading through the land. Most of the new Gothic cathedrals were dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady. God, the supreme judge, was remote from men. Mary, the Mother of God, seemed closer, more understanding and forgiving. The cult of chivalry, invented by and for the nobility, and the cult of Virgin Mary, popular with the masses, developed separately, but both helped to slowly shed a softening influence on society. Henry was still in England when Eleanor gave birth to her first son, named William after both her father and Henry's great-grandfather, William the Conqueror. When Henry returned to Normandy, Eleanor and her baby were there to greet him. Henry was overjoyed with this little baby, as he would be with all the 7 other children Eleanor was to bear him in the next decade. Henry added to their joy the good news that his campaigns had been successful, that he had forced the English King Stephen to acknowledge him as the next king of England, though they would have to wait until Stephen died. The future was full of promise. While the world was opening up for Eleanor and Henry, Louis's future looked bleaker and bleaker. But after consulting his chaplains, Louis bestirred himself and took a second wife in the desperate hope that he might yet have a son and heir. While still in Normandy, Eleanor met her new mother-in-law, Matilda, a formidable, outspoken woman, not much loved but sometimes admired for her toughness, intelligence, and courage. She was nothing like Louis's nagging mother, but blunt and to the point, with a keen sense of politics. Eleanor could see where Henry got his political sharpness and his unrelenting ambition. Matilda, granddaughter of William the Conqueror, had tried to assert her own right to the English throne, but the English had not been ready for a woman ruler and had chosen her worthless cousin Stephen instead. During this weak reign, the feudal barons got out of hand. Anarchy and civil war devastated the English countryside. Eleanor and Henry did not have long to wait. Far sooner than expected came the welcome news that King Stephen had died in the fall of 1154. Few Englishmen regretted his death, and longing for a strong, wise ruler, they eagerly awaited the young Duke and Duchess of Normandy. Henry was just 21, and Eleanor 32. Things were falling into place at a giddy pace. Nothing seemed to stand in the way of this well-matched couple, who could now look forward to ruling over lands that stretched all the way from the borders of Scotland to the borders of Spain. The news was received in Paris with alarm. That Eleanor had had a son was hard enough for Louis to bear. Now his worst fears had come true.